Into an in-depth comparison of the U.S. and China's militaries on here, at least on this channel, yet. And I'm not going to really do that today, but a good excuse to touch on it just fell into my lap. So, according to a report in the Financial Times, came out this week, in August, China tested a new type of weapon. And it's a very dangerous type of weapon called, well, it's basically called orbital bombardment, or really fractional orbital bombardment, but I'll just be calling it orbital bombardment. It doesn't really matter here. Funny enough, there's a whole old Soviet Cold War kerfuffle about this, which is why I got called that, but it doesn't really matter. But yeah, this is an old Cold War idea and weapon. It was briefly deployed by the Soviet Union, and basically the way orbital bombardment works is you send objects up into a partial orbit in space and then rain them down on your enemies. During the Cold War, the object of choice was a nuclear warhead, so it was about nuking, the U.S. from anywhere on Earth, launching stuff up in the Soviet Union and coming down on the U.S. with all your nukes. Today, the payload China is considering using, is basically hypersonic weapons. So there's these hypersonic glide vehicles that are really all the rage right now in the US, China, and Russia. And that is what China is thinking of launching up into space and then raining down on, well, the United States, if it ever came to that. Yeah, and so for people who don't know, hypersonic weapons right now are just a major area of competition between the US and China, and a bit from Russia. Like most of it is the same typical Russian overhyped stuff, because they don't actually have the ability to deploy anything or make a lot of units, or there's no high volume for any of their weapons, but it doesn't matter. This is really, really big news. So I'll touch on a couple things today. I'm going to talk about U.S. missile defense. I'm going to talk about sort of what this means, what it means for the sort of balanced power. But most of all, it's sort of what this means for where things are going to go with weapons, because space is a huge arena, and it has been since the Cold War. That was what started the whole Sputnik thing. And it's been coming back. I've been actually writing a really long article on this exact topic, just about what is up with China in space. And one of the core spoilers of it is that it's basically all about the military, and everything else, like competing with NASA, going to the moon, that is a serious sideshow. So yeah, we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about missiles. We're going to talk about what it works, and missile defense, and what hypersonic weapons are, and all this kind of stuff, and just kind of what it all means. So yeah, let's get back. Let's just get right into it. So the first thing to know is that this report could be wrong. The Chinese are already saying, hey, we didn't really do this. It's a space plane. It's this. It's that. But most of that doesn't quite fit. But still, this could be wrong, or it could be something that is very, very preliminary and maybe never gets developed or whatever. But for right now, I'm just going to assume that it's true, and that it's being developed, and that it's in the works, basically. And this sounds crazy, and everything. I'm going to talk about fractional orbital bombardment a lot more, and it's going to sound really crazy, and it really is kind of space age, new age, space age, crazy age stuff. And the media is going to talk about how this is all unprecedented and it's totally unexpected, but it's really, really not. First, like I said, this idea is like over 50 years old, and that by itself isn't new at all. But it's also just totally expected that China would do this. I mean, China's been focused on developing better missiles for over like 20 straight years. It fits with its whole basic military strategy of protecting itself in the Western Pacific. It needs these missiles. It needs to keep the U.S. out. It needs to threaten all the sorts of countries, and really missiles are one of the best ways to do it. So it's been heavily, heavily invested in it for years. I mean, basically the entire time it's been modernizing. And in general, it makes a lot of sense for countries like Russia and China to develop weapons that circumvent U.S. defenses and thwart them, basically. That's what we're going to talk about a bit later. This is what the U.S. does, right? This is why the U.S. has stealth weapons and stealth aircraft. It was to basically avoid Russian, originally Soviet, surface-to-air missiles and all that kind of stuff, and radar detection. That's what the U.S. did, and China's basically doing the same thing to our very ridiculous missile defense system, which I'm going to get into later. So, but the core of what I'm just saying now is, don't buy any of this. That this is some crazy, unexpected revelation. it's very unfortunate this is happening, but in a lot of ways, it really is just totally expected. And behind the scenes in the U.S., the real reason for all the angst we're going to hear about this kind of stuff is it's basically gets down to one basic thing, which is missile defense. So, there are a few areas of U.S. military research and development where you really feel like there's been so much spent for so little. And that's really saying something, because the U.S. military is hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And just this whole missile defense thing. So it goes back to Reagan. It was kind of evolved a bit under Clinton. And then during the Bush years, the early G.W. Bush in the 2000s, missile defense became a whole thing. It was after 9/11. It was after this axis of evil. It was all this kind of stuff. Missile defense became huge. The U.S. basically evolved something into the Missile Defense Agency, and it started investing a lot in trying to knock down missiles from rogue states, primarily, the whole Irans, North Koreas, and whatever of the world. And a lot of this was really just a poor man's rehash of Reagan's Star Wars 1980s space defense initiative, and it kind of had a lot. It's just the whole missile defense thing has had a lot less ambition, vision, and execution compared to that. This is basically what we got, like a really, really less ambitious, less impressive, less successful version of that. Not that that was successful; it didn't actually happen, but it's very weird that we all got really mad at the whole Star Wars thing, said it was really stupid, and then just proceeded to basically try and do that in a really watered down way. That is what happened. Like, don't let anyone tell you that isn't what happened. That is what happened. But the thing about missile defense is that it's been incredibly popular. The public likes it. Hey, we want to protect the homeland from crazy missiles from North Korea. All right, spend money on that. Military contractors like it because these missiles are extreme. All this development is extremely expensive. Even a lot of the scientific establishment likes it because you get a lot of basic research and development grants that went into this stuff that came from this agency. Both parties liked it because it's a very bipartisan military type initiative, right? This isn't foreign invasions in other countries, which the left doesn't like. This isn't any sort of humanitarian. This isn't any sort of less geopolitical use of the military, which the right doesn't tend to like. This is very much basic defense, what the Department of Defense should be doing in a lot of people's eyes, protect the homeland, that kind of thing. So it's been running for like 20 years. This Missile Defense Agency, it's just tens and tens of billions of dollars. But the whole thing, this whole project is just deeply flawed. People don't talk about this enough. Like, everyone seems to think that the U.S. has a giant missile shield around this country, which is just totally false. So first, we're just talking about missiles really quick, just to get a quick handle on this. I'm not going to go really in depth, and it's really complicated, and it's not worth it right now. But basically, a missile and a rocket can go. It can be everything from a little, almost a mortar, but like a little short range rocket you see a lot in Israel, to like larger weapons that can hit a whole theater of combat operations, all the way to like intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? The classic Cold War weapon. And there's a lot of complex variations in this, and there's a lot of improvements to the missiles and to the final warheads and the way they can maneuver and all this kind of stuff. So I'm not going to break it all down, but in general, all these missiles so far that I've talked about, all the missiles in general up till the 2010s, all these missiles, their flight trajectory creates like a parabola, right? It's just like an upside down U. And the purpose of missile defense, basically the agency broke everything down. They broke a missile's flight trajectory down into 4 phases, which is basically, you can knock out a missile when it launches, soon after, later on, or during sort of the final descent. And the military calls this the boost phase, the ascent phase, the mid-course, and the terminal phase of flight, right? So that's like beginning, or I guess I'll do it the other way. Beginning of the flight, the launch, so that's the boost. Then you have the ascent, then you have the mid-course, then you have the terminal phase. That's basically what a missile is. And the military has been the American Missile Defense is focused on creating missiles to knock out an enemy missile at every sort of point in that sort of flight path, that whole trajectory. And it hasn't been really accepted. I don't think there's actually anything yet for the ascent phase, and the whole thing is a disaster. But this is the sort of overarching vision of what the agency was trying to do. There's also separately, there's those 4 phases, and there's also the sort of left of launch before phase, where basically you can use cyber weapons, you can use other things to prevent missiles from even being launched or from being corrupted and failing to reach their target. There's a whole other area not related to really the the Missile Defense Agency that does that. It's kind of a lot more of the NSA type thing. But that's all a whole thing. And it's mostly missiles that you use to knock these down. There's attempts at lasers, but none of that's been really successful. Another huge area of wasted money. So that's the whole thing. And just as you can imagine, this is about knocking down missiles with missiles. And in particular, the missiles that are like ICBM type, these are huge, enormous, fast missiles. This is really difficult. This is not, it's very hard. It's very expensive. And to be honest, America, the United States has just not succeeded at all in this whole thing. So what happened is American missile defense just became like a feeding frenzy for contractors where very little got accomplished. The U.S. has fielded a couple systems. You probably, if you read the news, you'll see them. So there's something called THAAD, which is the Terminal High Altitude Missile Defense System, which now we got it. Terminal is that last phase. High altitude. That's one. Then there's the ground-based, the GMB, which is the ground-based mid-course defense system. So now again, ground-based. So this is not in space. It's rockets in the ground. They're in, I think, California and Alaska. And there's a giant rockets that you use to try and attack hit missiles in the mid-course, right? Third part of it. And then you have old Patriot missiles. And then there's the Navy has this Aegis defense system, which is used in a lot of its destroyers. And it's basically an evolution of a sort of the naval missile defense system for its ships. And it can attack different ballistic and other types of missiles. So that's the basic stuff. And this Aegis thing is actually going onshore. So it's moving from ships to places, near Japan and probably Guam, places like that. And that is basically what the U.S. has. And, there are more improvements and systems on the way. But the dirty little secret of all of this is that most of these missiles, most of the American defenses, they're just not that great. They wouldn't work. There's too few of them. Like it's almost a farce. Like against a country like China, with all its advanced missiles, even just the nuclear context, there's no current, future, or projected U.S. defenses that could defeat Chinese nuclear missiles. None, zero. And then definitely not all the normal conventional kinetic weapons it has. It's just not even feasible. It's insanely expensive. So, another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this is just not. There's so much hype. So we're gonna get back to what's going on, the orbital bombardment, and all this. But the big thing behind this is going to be just how it unravels this entire nonsense about American missile defense. It's going to try to. It really should. Maybe this thing will just amble on a bit more. But let's just talk about why this got so bad. So just to be clear, there's only like 16 or 18 Patriot missile battalions that the U.S. Army has. And these were originally designed, like Patriot missiles were designed to, they were designed to help Army units on the move, right? This was not designed to protect, stationary cities and stuff like that. It really wasn't. And there's not enough troops for it. And like 5 of them are permanently stationed abroad, 2 are for testing. You really have 10 or 11 of these. There's very few of them. The ground-based, the GMB, basically those mid-course missiles, there's like 30 or 60 or something. They're insanely expensive. They mostly don't work. And the truth is, most of these are missiles, all these U.S. systems, they're designed like 12, 15 years ago. There's not been a lot of iteration. So basically, the core problem for all these things is there's no real-world testing of these missiles. There's really poor and infrequent testing when they do it. And there's just a fear of failure throughout the whole missile defense initiative. I mean, basically, what happened is everyone fears, the military and the politicians feared actually testing these things because it would show that they don't work. It feared to give, it was fearful of doing real, honest testing because it didn't want to lose the funding for them. And it got into this place where you're basically not testing these missiles and just doing all this sort of academic almost research and development and all this, but you're not actually developing systems and you're not iterating on them. There's no trial and error in this whole process. There's just, these are systems, all these missiles I'm talking about, really, Patriots, which, by the way, they're not even that good. The Patriot missiles are just not even that good. Anyone who tells you otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. They're old, and they're rarely iterated on, developed, and improved. Instead, they've actually really atrophied all of these systems. Like, there's tens of billions of dollars they want to put into these ground-based mid-course defense, and these missiles are archaic at this point. It's really crazy. I mean, a good example of missiles or rockets that have really improved, you look at something like SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, which is different. But honestly, the cost of a Falcon 9 rocket is a lot less than these crazy missiles that the U.S. is trying to use to knock down other missiles. And think about it. You suddenly had 100, 200 of these. Not only do they don't work, but they're too expensive. It's a whole problem. But yeah, the Falcon 9 has been rapidly iterated on, and it's been improving for, 10 years, and to become, the most successful sort of rocket. It can land, it can do all sorts of crazy stuff. There's just been none of that in any missile defense, any of the U.S. systems. No one should believe that these are actually viable. No one should. They're extremely limited. They'd work in very small, rare sort of circumstances. And even a country like North Korea knows exactly what the U.S. can do and can probably get around it. It's just really that simple. And any sort of country that launched just a few missiles would rapidly overwhelm the whole system, and it's a whole disaster. But what happened is that basically missile defense became the golden goose, that nobody wanted to let go of. So military, the industry, as in defense industry, politicians, everyone, it was just this sort of incestuous thing where nobody wanted to actually test and validate these systems. They didn't want to be shown to be pathetic and inadequate. So that's really what's going on behind the scenes. So China is developing a crazy new weapon, which, as we'll see, invalidates all of this anyway. And then we're going to rapidly realize that this whole thing was basically kind of a farce. So not good. One thing I will say is that there are a lot of undisclosed electronic and space-based countermeasures and things the U.S. has developed, particularly the new Space Force, or what is becoming the Space Force. There's enormous amount of what goes on in the U.S. military space budget that is black, that is undisclosed, and there are almost certainly all sorts of systems related to this. But nonetheless, the actual missiles the U.S. uses to launch and try and defeat any other sort of foreign enemy's missiles, they're limited at best. They're just insanely expensive to develop and to deploy and to maintain over their lifetime. And just to be clear, we're talking like not tens of billions of dollars. We're talking like hundreds of billions. These are old. These are rapidly becoming old, particularly these GMB missiles. These are becoming old systems that you have to it costs money, excess money just to maintain them because they're so old. Their electronics are weak. It's all bad. It's all bad. Meanwhile, actually, one of the funny things is that one of the best U.S. missiles, just one of the ones that China, for example, keeps its eye on, is something called the SM-6 missile. And it's a Navy missile that's been heavily expanded and upgraded over the years. It was part of this Aegis system. It's a whole thing. But unlike the MDA, the Missile Defense Agency, the SM-6 missile, Standard Missile 6, is widely deployed. It's frequently tested, and it's iteratively upgraded. And it's been for 15, 16, almost 18 years or something. It's been developed and improved. And that is, it has this trial and error. It has this actual feedback and use going on. And so this missile is about to become a hypersonic missile and a future upgrade. It's going to be used to some limited degree to defeat ballistic and other sorts of missiles. And it has just enormous improvements. And it's very likely that the Army and the Marines and other people are going to use this missile because it's actually viable, while all the stuff that comes out of the Missile Defense Agency is mostly not. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And the foil for all of this is Israel. So everyone's seen all the footage of whenever there's a crisis between Israel and the Palestinians, the Israeli Iron Dome system comes in and knocks a bunch of missiles out of the sky. So this is, again, this is the foil for the United States. If people in the U.S. think that America has something like that, they are sorely mistaken. Israel has a multi-tiered missile defense system. Iron Dome is the most well-known and most well-tested of its systems. And the Israeli system is the most advanced and capable system on the planet. This is well known by anyone who works in this kind of field. And it's just not the same. It's not because it's not the same in the United States. It's not because Israel has smarter people or better companies or more money. It's just because it's testing them, and there's a real existential need for the system. It gets real world testing in major conflicts where it needs to be used. The systems are iterated based on constant feedback, and so it progressively and organically became, the best missile defense system in the world. It didn't become it because a bunch of money was thrown into PowerPoints and to hypothetical theories and random studies and all this kind of stuff the Missile Defense Agency does. It actually had to build it and had a situation where it needed it. So that's what happened. And to be clear, the U.S. heavily invested in all of this because it wanted this as well. And also many of the other things besides Iron Dome in Israel, they're not as well tested. So that's the Arrow system, this sort of magic wand, whatever it's called. All these are less well tested because there isn't actually that same missile threat. The Israeli missile threat is typically is almost entirely smaller missiles. Not if it gets into a conflict with someone else besides the Palestinians, but for all the testing of the last, whatever it is, 10 years or so, it's been with smaller missiles. In the U.S. and Israel, in many ways, yeah, and just to be clear, like once the Iron Dome did well, it spiraled up. It kept doing better. It's like the opposite of the Missile Defense Agency, where it doesn't do well, it doesn't test, it doesn't get any recognition, just kind of becomes more and more incompetent and just atrophies. In Israel, it's it's a nation. It's considered a nationwide success, and there's buy-in from the government. The military, the population gets funding, respect, prestige, everything. It's like a national asset, a treasure. So it gets all sorts of talent goes to work on it, improve it, all that. Very different from the United States. To be clear, Israel and the United States are facing very different threats. The U.S., Mexico, and Canada are not going to start lobbing missiles into neighboring. It's not going to start getting missiles from Tijuana into San Diego, right? This isn't just going to happen. So there's not really a place to test any of this in the same way. The U.S. is facing larger, faster, higher flying, more maneuverable, and more deadly missiles. So it's a very different scenario. But the fundamental thing that you can't just have these hypothetical, like theory-based things and expect them to work, that really still holds. And Israeli missile defense has been, it's been in an awkward position. It's very awkward for the United States, this whole thing. Israel spent way less money than the U.S. has on, like, tens of billions of dollars less on missile defense. And it has this system that is very effective. And the U.S. tries to take credit for it because it's paid, for a lot of this, and it gives Israel the funding to restock the missiles that it uses as interceptors and all that. But it also gets major pushback from U.S. industry because it shines such a bad light on the U.S. successes. No one thinks that there's anything as comparable to Iron Dome in the U.S. military. And basically, there's also a company called Raytheon, which builds a lot of U.S. missiles, that partnered with the Israeli company that builds the interceptors to basically manufacture the same Iron Dome interceptors in the United States, sell them to the U.S., et cetera, the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and it's doing all that. And the U.S. is testing, the Iron Dome for certain things, but it's very ambivalent with this whole thing. So, the U.S. Army recently decided against using the Iron Dome, gave it to a different contractor, which had, an untested missile, basically, or like a bizarre, it's not even untested, it's like pulled from a air-to-air thing. It's a whole very weird situation. But, that's where it is. I mean, the truth is, the deep fundamental truth is the ironic truth of all this missile defense stuff is that there's been a profound erosion, actually, in the U.S. military's missile defense capabilities. So all this focus on the Homeland Defense, which is the Missile Defense Agency, which has been largely a failure. There's that, and then the actual military, the protection of army units, tanks, all this sort of stuff has been sidelined for years. So the whole thing, and basically the U.S. military is heavily investing now in improving all these systems because while China has been massively improving and expanding its own missiles, the U.S. has not kept up with actual useful missile defense capabilities for its units, for its troops, for any of that. So it is a very touchy subject. And there's going to be just the same way right now, the U.S. military and the U.S. Navy in particular and the Air Force are investing a lot in new missiles that have longer ranges, more maneuverable, higher speeds to combat Chinese advances against ships and all that. There's going to be a similar thing to defend against Chinese missiles. And, again, the irony of all of this is that there's supposed to be a massive missile defense agency that was supposed to have solved a lot of these or improved or developed all these systems that would be useful, and none of it came to pass. So all this talk about the missile defense is, it's just to go show it's a touchy subject in the U.S. military and the government because there's a huge corrupt thing going on behind the scenes with it. And, that's all fine. But all this is made worse now because of hypersonic missiles. So, like I said earlier, this is the new it thing to research and develop and deploy in major militaries. They're all the rage these days. Basically, these are conventional missiles that fly more than 5 times the speed of sound. This speed lets them hit their targets like insanely fast. And they also have these glide vehicles. There's many things they could have at the end, but very popular sort of payload is it's called a hypersonic glide vehicle, and basically it can be a very maneuverable object that can very hard to defeat. Basically, very maneuverable, high speed, altitude changes, all this very complex stuff. It has blown up that whole thing of the whole, that U and the E's thing. A hypersonic missile can just come in and just zigzag its way to whatever it wants to do. It is a major threat, and it's a big deal. So hypersonic missiles are everywhere. There's a very weird thing going on where the entire U.S. military is basically developing missiles now. The Army wants hypersonic missiles. The Navy, the Air Force, everyone wants to be in this missile game because it's opening up a whole new class of military operations. It's changing expectations for conflicts and how they might play out because speed matters. Speed means lethality. It compresses time frames. It does a lot of things that are very complex and challenging for military operations, basically. And all these hypersonic missiles require new defensive strategies. There's not a single thing in the U.S. missile defense architecture that can defend against any of these. And, this is, again, like I said earlier, this is why Russia and China are developing them, because it invalidates everything. So not only was the missile defense stuff garbage in the first place, the U.S. stuff, now there are missiles where it's just not even feasible for them to defend against any of it. So, there's all sorts of crazy, and so a lot of it is frankly, crazy and unworkable ideas about how to combat hypersonic missiles. But based on the Missile Defense Agency's really poor record with traditional missiles, no one's going to bet that they're actually going to be able to solve any of this. There's massive investment going on in space sensors, systems, tracking, and all that. But this is a really, really important and profound sort of new area for military thinking, I guess you could say. And hence the entire U.S. military is reorganizing and trying to figure out what to do about all this. And that brings us back to China's recent hypersonic test flight of this system that uses orbital bombardment or fractional orbital bombardment. This is a type of hypersonic missile. And like I was saying, there's a concept that now uses a hypersonic missile as a payload. And this is among the most threatening and destabilizing sort of weapon that basically could be announced, period. And I'll try and break down a bit why. And basically, the orbital bombardment missiles, they go up into space, they're launched into space, and they orbit the Earth at high altitudes. And then, they aim down at the planet at some random moment, and then, gain massive speed before striking their targets. What this means, like when you think about it, launching something up into space and just having it move around, and then just start coming down from anywhere. These missiles can attack from unexpected trajectories. They can hit you at weird angles and in places you didn't expect. There's no real range limitation on this missile because it's partially circling the Earth, which means you don't know when it's going to strike, and you have no idea. You can't track or trace, because a lot of what happens with missile tracking is that you see where a missile is, you do some basic analysis of its initial trajectory, and then you can sort of trace the parabola. That's a lot of what happens in the tracking systems. Well, you can't track or trace any of this with these orbital bombardment weapons. So it's a real big deal. And it's tough. And also when these finally do hit, they're moving so fast and with so much force, and they have these maneuverable weapons at the end that you don't have much time to react, and you're not going to be able to hit it down. So dozens of these, there's just no way to defend against any of this. To say that U.S. defenses are not prepared to deal with this is really putting it mildly. What we're actually seeing is it's shining a really negative light on the whole missile defense architecture. A lot of this is old. All the tracking systems, the early warning systems, a lot of this stuff was Cold War era stuff, designed to deal with ballistic missiles, particularly ballistic missiles coming over the North Pole from the Soviet Union. So people might not know, but there's this Mount Cheyenne. There's basically this organization called NORAD, which basically tracks threats to North America. It's in the base of this mountain and I think it's in Colorado. I actually can't remember, but it's it's in this mountain, and basically NORAD is there. It's designed. It's in the mountain, so it can withstand nuclear strikes, and its purpose is to defend the country against all these attacks. But everything during the Cold War was coming over the North Pole, right? So it was, and all the systems and sensors are oriented in that direction. But orbital bombardment, these can come from wherever. They can come from the South Pole. They can come from any direction. And just to be clear, like a ballistic missile, these are just missiles that go very high up. They gain a lot of speed. They go a long way, and they come down with a lot of force. So these hypersonic missiles typically are sort of a bit lower, and they're not quite ballistic missiles, but they're still fast enough and far enough that they're very dangerous. And that there's something actually more simple about the ballistic trajectory. There's a lot of familiarity with it. There's a lot less with the hypersonic one. So that is really what we're seeing. So this whole American missile defense thing is really the whole thing is built on leaving aside the missile defense, the actual missiles used to sort of launch it that are relatively newer. This is all Cold War stuff, and it's really old. So it's a real change. And like I was saying with the ballistic missile, that's a known trajectory. Orbital bombardment is very different. It doesn't follow the traditional ballistic trajectory, and it basically scrambles this whole game. So that's what's happening. That is what's happening. And the U.S. military, this is part of the reason there's a Space Force, right? This is some of what's going on. So the U.S. military is known for years that these systems were outdated. And there's all these plans, actually very impressive plans, some of them, to build massive primarily space-based systems to replace all this really outdated stuff. Give comprehensive tracking, much more 360 global stuff. It's very impressive. And this is a lot of why there is a Space Force. The whole concept of hypersonic missiles, the only way to use a hypersonic missile, move so fast, and it can't sort of do a lot of its own positioning. It needs satellites to actually do it. There's a whole reason why you need space involved in everything. Whether you're using hypersonic missiles or you're trying to defeat them, any of it, you need space. So the U.S. has been preparing improved systems for a while, but all this is just years away. We're not going to see any new satellites, and I mean, these are constellations too. The plan is actually to launch lots and lots and lots of these satellites in all these different layers, and it's a whole thing. But this is going to take years. We're talking early 2030s before all this comes together at best. And missiles to defeat all this stuff, not coming in this decade. So this is what's happened now is that in general, war is about offense and defense. And at different times, one hand is stronger. So like in medieval Europe, castles were stronger than any of the sort of cavalry, and it was very hard to breach them, and defense had the upper hand. So you could sit in your castle, be fine as long as you had food and you had water and stuff. And that's fine. For most of Chinese history, it was kind of the opposite. Mobile armed cavalry were very hard to defend in combat, and offense often had the upper hand in China. That was very different. Today we're in a world where offense is once again gaining the upper hand in the military. And, this is a bit of a dilemma because you're going to see a huge push for more missile defense spending, probably. I mean, there's very unlikely everyone's going to say what I was saying, which is most of this, it was garbage and didn't work. That's kind of humiliating to say if you've been really investing in all this. And, we're basically going to say we're going to try harder. That's probably what we'll get, which is fine because, it is what it is. You can't pretend like you're doing nothing, especially when you spend as much money as the U.S. military spends. But again, the harsh reality, it's weak against these current systems, and it's basically hypothetical against all these new systems. So we're going to get more missile defense spending. But the truth is that when defense is impossible, offense becomes the option. So that's really where things go. Like, people are always worried about space getting militarized. Well, space is getting militarized, and there's really nothing you can do about it. There's no way to, demilitarize space the same way it's very difficult to denuclearize the world in the same vein. Especially when you get into a situation where, the military calculus is one where offense has the upper hand. This is why you got hundreds, thousands of missiles, nuclear missiles developed by the U.S. and China during the 50s and 60s. There was no feasible defenses. The U.S. actually did some ballistic missile defense stuff, but it was rapidly, once you had thousands, it was clear even back in the 70s that missile defense was a dubious proposition. It was only really brought back in part because the idea was, oh, it's rogue states only, and you could sort of figure it out for a couple. But yeah, it's very scary when offense becomes the only option, because then you can get into very dangerous spirals of, hey guys, we now have 10,000 hypersonic missiles. What do we do about this? This is one subtle reason actually why U.S. missile defense has lasted so long, even though it's produced so little. It allows people to feel like we have defenses. So there's not as much pressure to go on the offense, right? There's something about it. It actually is Russia and China would probably disagree, but it is a moderating influence in some ways, missile defense. Again, Russia and China heavily disagree. They think it destabilizes things. They think that this, mutually assured destruction sort of thing is actually much more favorable, but we're much more balanced and sort of neutral. But there's different arguments for that. But, for example, it's an interesting question. Missile defense, it actually calms people down, right? What would it be like would we have allowed North Korea to become as dangerous and threatening as it is today if we hadn't been subtly told that, oh, we're developing defenses and we'll just knock down their missiles? In 2005, would there have been major attacks on North Korea, at some point earlier, if the U.S. hadn't had this feeling, psychological feeling, rightly or wrongly, that it could defend against these missiles? The feeling that you can defend against something really does, prevent you from, especially the United States, from going apeshit and just, start smashing things everywhere. So for all I was hating on the missile defense stuff earlier, maybe it wasn't really a military thing. Maybe it was more of a political psychology thing. And that's another lens to view it from. Because we need defenses to feel psychologically secure and to avoid feeling the need to do preemptive strikes or develop even more powerful weapons. Because again, this can provoke your enemies to do the exact same thing, and then on until conflict can become inevitable. That is what we're trying to avoid. And if this train of logic feels familiar, it's because it is, because this is very eerily similar to 1950s Cold War nuclear thinking. Like I was saying, this is what got us all those nuclear weapons and all those ICBMs. In a lot of ways, the old Cold War nuclear conundrum has come back to haunt us. And, I mostly ignore Cold War comparisons. The U.S. and China, they're in a Cold War and this and that. I think most of that is really off the mark for a lot of reasons. But in this specific area of missiles and advanced intercontinental military weapons, it actually really does kind of fit. And it's also really a helpful parallel, because what you start to see when offense outstrips defense is you're going to start seeing calls for moderation. So in the 60s, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, started working on arms control agreements. And you got an anti-nuclear weapons movement that spawned a lot around the world, and particularly in the United States. So these sort of missile and weapon developments are the sort of things that can cause movements to ameliorate tensions, at least military tensions, between the U.S. and China. And that's not a bad thing on its own. There's, I'll be honest, I think it's highly likely that China is even doing these sorts of tests to gain leverage against the United States. Like the Soviet Union, it probably realizes its military systems that are designed like almost exclusively to attack the United States are very useful bargaining chips, because I've discussed this before, but the truth is, China doesn't need orbital bombardment if it gets into a regional conflict with Japan or Taiwan. You don't need to send something up in space to launch it a couple hundred miles or 1,000 miles off your coast. That doesn't make any sense. This is entirely for the United States, or for other global operations, which is even farther from China's capacity. So this is aimed directly at the United States, and that's a dangerous thing. For China, it would make a lot of sense to suggest that it has this sort of capability, that it's partially developing it, and then decide to give it up in exchange for some sort of agreement with the United States, whether it's economic, political, whatever you want. The Soviet Union did this all the time. It really did this all the time. And for China right now, hypersonic weapons in general are, as I went through pretty in depth, like they already invalidate the whole U.S. missile defense thing. They're already completely transforming what the U.S. military thinks it needs to do and how it needs to defend itself and how it needs to fight. So there's massive changes already going on. Do you really, really need orbital bombardment and that or fractional orbital bombardment? Basically, the fractional thing is there's an outer space treaty, came up in the 50s and 60s, and it was about how to use space, and we're not going to militarize space, right? That was the whole idea of this treaty. And when the Soviet Union did its orbital bombardment tests and started to develop these systems, the U.S. got into a whole thing where it was like, we don't want to say that the Soviet Union has broken this outer space treaty, so we called it fractional orbital bombardment because it was technically like a fractional orbit. Like, you don't send it all the way up in orbit, you just send it kind of, you don't need to. You don't need to go all the way up in orbit for these missiles, so you send it sort of into a fractional orbit, which is partial, and it won't go all the way up. And the whole point of this fractional thing was just to kind of not break the outer space treaty. But we're in a world, like I was saying, this treaty is not attuned with current and future realities, probably. Depends on how China's trajectory holds. If it maintains itself through the 2020s, the Chinese state, the Chinese political state, space will be heavily militarized by 2030, most likely. So if it doesn't, the U.S. will feel a lot less pressure for all these things, and it could actually be tamped down. Maybe it doesn't become as big a deal. But the problem for China, the orbital bombardment, and the reason I think it might use it as leverage is because this could easily backfire. This is a system that's designed to attack the United States, and what the problem, if we're in a world where you've removed the sense of defense the U.S. has, and you want to totally invest in offense, well, the U.S. is going to do the same thing as well. And you don't want the United States to suddenly start investing even more in offensive hypersonic weapons. I mean, that's really bad news for China. It's even possible that this test and how it's being highlighted by U.S. officials and generals and contractors, it could very well be something that's being used to encourage more military spending in this area for just this reason. A lot of the U.S. military knows missile defense is largely useless. A lot of the missile defenses at theater level and all that has degraded immensely compared to an atrophy, basically compared to the current threats. So they know it's all garbage. And they very well could be pushing this orbital bombardment thing to get the U.S. to do more. I mean, many people right now want to see how much the U.S. can accomplish when faced with a real competitor, and they're actively milking this great power competition idea about U.S. and China for all it's worth, right? Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe the U.S. can develop all sorts of things that'll be good and have downstream benefits for the world or whatever. Maybe not. But that's definitely what's going on. And I'm not saying, I actually do think this is probably, pretty likely plausible sort of test for reasons I kind of laid out earlier. But nonetheless, there's going to be pressure. There's going to be definitely people in the U.S. who are wanting to hype it up. And it's very possible that China wants to do the opposite. But China's diplomacy right now is very unhinged and doesn't quite know what it's doing or what it wants to do. So you really can only take that with a grain of salt. But in general, news like this is really effective at getting the U.S. to freak the U.S. out. I mean, there's nothing more galling to the U.S. public than appearing to be technologically behind another country in an area with military applicability, right? I mean, this is what Sputnik, which was basically a giant, metal basketball, gave us NASA in the moon landings because the United States freaked out that it was behind, that it was all this, even though it wasn't. That's what this is also doing, right? The entire U.S. military is already reorienting towards China, and the U.S. is not constrained in the way China is. This is why it could be so bad for China, because this is kind of what the Soviet Union did: developed orbital bombardment, ended up just getting rid of it. It's expensive. There's other reasons back then too, but also it didn't encourage the U.S. to do the exact same thing. Like I've said a lot, the U.S. and China are very different places. China is surrounded by hostile countries. It has to punch its way out past all these hostile countries that are advanced, and Japan is the third largest economy in the world, and it's right off your coast. Taiwan is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, and it's even closer, even more right directly off your coast. South Korea is the same sort of thing. You have to get to fighting the United States. That's the real way to think about it. Very difficult to do. The United States does not have to get through anyone to get to you. So, for almost 80 years, the U.S. has been involved in near permanent global expeditionary war, I mean, it's really unheard of. It's completely unheard of in human history for anything like this. And but the U.S. has been doing it for a very long time, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. Um, and unlike China, it doesn't have to tangle with its neighbors, and it can fight all over the world and on other continents. So hypersonic weapons really fit the U.S. military style of expeditionary war, and orbital bombardment fits even better. I mean, again, there's real challenges about miscalculations and nukes and all sorts of things that are very real, very, very, very real challenges. But nonetheless, hypersonic weapons, part of the reason China and Russia are developing hypersonic weapons is to not feel totally exposed and vulnerable if and when the U.S. does. They don't want the U.S. to get there first. Because again, the U.S. is the one that does the global war. The other countries really try and find their niche and consolidate their sort of presence in their own regions. It's a very different sort of thing. And to antagonize the U.S. and do all this stuff, do this orbital bombardment, it could very well lead the U.S. to go green and start smashing things, which is not a good idea for China. And yeah, I'm not saying that the U.S. there's no consequences and the U.S. can do whatever it likes in military fashion. It's really not true. And although the U.S. seems to go to war in Iraq, go to war in Afghanistan, go green and smash things and leave, and the country itself doesn't seem to suffer, it's really not true. There's a lot of problems that go along with all this, but the U.S. has leeway, it has give, it has slack where it can do these sorts of things repeatedly, and the country still continues. And it's very dangerous for a country like China. So the idea this could backfire. You've removed the sense of defense the U.S. had, and now you're back to like offense on offense situations. Very bad, especially when the U.S. is now officially out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan, and is freaking out. By the way, the U.S. military is freaking out because it thinks it has been wasting many years on these more relevant conflicts that didn't lead to much of anything, while a massive competitor has been growing silently in the background. That is what's happened. And the military is already trying to make up for lost time. So that's where we are. For years, the U.S. wrongly thought it had a magic shield, Iron Dome, protecting it from enemy missiles, and it doesn't. And that's what happened, and it's totally exposed now. But what China's orbital bombardment test might lead to, and it's already trending this way anyway, is that a few years from now, the U.S. may not have a magic shield, but it may have a golden spear that's capable of lightning strikes all over the world very rapidly, which is a capability of the U.S. Precision global strike, I think it's called. It's been like a 90s concept it's been around for like 20 or 30 years, and it's finally coming to fruition with a lot of these hypersonic weapons. It is a very dangerous thing, and the U.S. is going to use it. And that's the other thing people need to realize. China can have all these missiles and all this stuff, and North Korea can, but they don't actually use it. The U.S. will almost certainly use these missiles. Right now, only 5 countries on Earth are capable of striking targets anywhere on Earth. It's Russia, China, the United States, France, and Great Britain, I think. And that's part of the reason that is the way it is, because of all these treaties, all this stuff. But the U.S., it's very likely the U.S. will use missile strikes to keep it that way, and to do whatever it wants to do on other continents to basically impose its strategic will and goals and priorities on other countries. I mean, this is the reality of politics, whether we like it or not. And that's where we are. So I mentioned earlier, I mean, this is a redo of some of the Cold War era. It's offense versus offense now. Missile defense is basically bogus at this point. There's no real viable missile defense against current missiles, to be honest, but definitely not against hypersonic missiles for the next decade. And that's the way it's going to be. So it's a new and very dangerous situation. I think it's going to lead the U.S. to develop a lot of offensive weapons. I think it's going to develop and use a lot of these offensive weapons. Again, it's also much easier to test offensive weapons because you just fight with them. It's much harder because people don't tend to launch missiles at the American homeland. That's the other thing. The U.S. can test a lot of its weapons because of this global expeditionary war that it is on forever. So that's where things are. And it's really not good. Like, this isn't the way to do diplomacy. You don't want to just be launching missiles all over the place and thinking you're a big dog. It's makes you feel decisive and like you're getting something done. And Donald Trump even did it while eating chocolate cake, right, in Florida with Xi Jinping. You can just launch strikes on Libya or Syria or whatever it was. But this isn't going to change a lot of things in the world. And the world's getting a lot more dangerous. So adding in, so that's kind of the flip in this episode. I know everyone's very worried about the Chinese missiles, but the almost certain outcome of this is not, oh my God, China has a military capability the U.S. can't defend against. What is it going to do? We're doomed. It's going to be like, no, the U.S. is going to develop just as capable offensive military weapons, and it's probably going to use them. Probably not against China, but against all sorts of other countries. And that's where we're going. So I hope that was helpful. Just getting a sense of what was actually going on in the news, that we should have predicted this. This is not unpredictable. I mean, this is expected because of U.S. missile defenses, which have now been sort of totally invalidated, and we're moving into a new world. So I'm curious what you guys think. If you thought this was totally off, bogus analysis, I have no idea what I'm talking about, let me know. Throw it in the comments, send me a message, whatever. And yeah, share, like, pass this on, and I'll see you next time.